Okay, we are on chapter 6, the stars and the planets. A very long chapter here, and it begins saying the Gola circling Mount Meru above the earth, and then we talk about 3 different divisions within that. The lunar mansions, houses, and the emergence of the planets is the first one. The second, how the stars and planets orbit the skies. And the third, the Gola of the earth, emergence of the seasons. So we're talking about the external world, and in Kalachakra it relates the external world to the internal world is the reason that we need to have some understanding of this. So the first part is the lunar mansions, houses, which are the 12 signs of the zodiac, and the emergence of the planets. In the first quote there, the birth houses are spoken of as Aries and so forth, so we're using the same names as in Western astrology for those. So that should be familiar to us. And then below the quote, therefore in the beginning, not sure what beginning is being referred to, whether it's the universe or just the calendar. It seems to be more the calendar than the universe here in terms of the explanations. So in the beginning, the lunar mansions, houses, and other stars were formed. Then the sun was born in Cancer. This marked the first actual year. It became the ruler of the solar days. Then the sun moved counterclockwise and arrived in the lunar mansion of Ashvini, and in line with the meridian of the central sector of the east. So we start in the east. The moon was born, and that is explained that the moon was born in Aries. And so then we have the first lunar day. It talks about 31 different signs as a part of that, which approximates the number of days in a month. And we have some months that have 30, some that have 31, and of course we have one that has 28 or occasionally 29. So there's some variation here. And then the first light of the moon came out of that, the first lunar day, the light of the moon. The moon became the ruler of that day, and the first Karana, or calendar year, began. Because of this, Aries is the first of the houses. Ashvini is the first of the lunar mansions. And so the waxing is the first of the 2 halves. So if you divide it into halves, the waxing is the first half of the month. And because the lunar mansion is on the 15th day of that moon was Citra, the month of that name was posited as the first of the months. From there we have Mars being born, the sun and the moon alternating, and then we have Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. It says the reason why the planets must have been born in this order is that they could not have been born at the same time, because it is taught that they each had different birth houses and birth lunar mansions. So you can't have them born at the same time if they each are in different mansions. And all 7 alternating planets were born directly in line with the center of the central eastern sector. They were therefore born successively. So that's a fairly logical explanation, that if you assume that some of the basic underlying principles are in fact true. So we're on page 107. So this is the order of the birth, and it is not the order found in other Kalachakra or other practices. So it's differentiating between different forms and different explanations of how this is described. In the middle of the page here, then it talks about the planets. It says that they, in the quote, they fight with each other and are enemies. They are peaceful and wrathful. And so in the description then that follows in the next paragraph, it talks about how when they line up in certain patterns that's considered to be fighting with each other. And it goes through in detail about which ones can be fighting with which other ones as a part of this. And then in the bottom paragraph there on 107, it also then begins to list some additional conditions based on positions of these for fighting. So he gives one list and then he adds there's also some other things that can cause this tension among the planets and houses and so forth. Then on page 108, all the stars, lunar mansions, and planets are themselves propelled by the power of the Gola winds. And that section, there's a section in here that describes the Gola term in fair detail starting on page 114. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. This movement is known as the Gola wind movement. And it is clockwise around Meru. Meru is considered to be the center of all of this. Everything rotates around Mount Meru. And Mount Meru is considered to be Mount Kailash in Tibet, but this is more of a symbolic form of that. And then we have the progressive early steps and regressive later steps, so there are variations on how these appear in the sky, and we know that they actually go around continuously, but how they appear from the planet Earth can vary. It can appear that they're going forward, or it can appear that they're going backward in the sky because of the movement of the planet Earth itself. And then in the second paragraph there, it talks about the alignments with various birth signs as a part of that. And then at the bottom, the great commentary says, now the text speaks of the appearance and disappearance of planets. Whatever planets dwell within the tenacy of the sun will definitely disappear. So they go behind the sun basically, or at least close enough that the rays of the sun block them out. And then it will not be seen and is said to have disappeared. So it hasn't actually disappeared, of course. It's just gone out of our field of vision. And then also at the top of page 109, abandoning the sun, it will rise. So it comes back again as it moves around behind the sun, it reappears. And then similarly, when the peaceful planets, Venus, Ketu, and Mercury, set into the sun from the left, and when they rise, they do so also from the left. The planets, the wrathful planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, rise and set from the right of the sun. And again, this is due to the movement of the Earth and how it appears in the sky from the planet Earth. So when the peaceful and wrathful planets meet, the wrathful will pass to the right of the peaceful, and the peaceful will pass to the left of the wrathful. So fortunately for us, they're not going to run into each other. And of course, they're quite a ways apart in actuality, but we're talking about how it appears to be. It also talks a little bit here about Rahu and Kalagni, and in talking about them, it talks about the head and the tail. It appears this could be talking about a comet, but it also could be talking about an eclipse, which is the impression that I got. And here where the head is the beginning of the eclipse and the tail is the end of the eclipse, although it doesn't really clarify this very much. Talks a little bit about full moon and no moon and so forth. Moving on to page 110, it goes to the second part of the discussion here, how the stars and planets orbit in the skies. And so this has two parts, the assertion of others and our own position. So the examination of the assertions of others. So I think here we probably better skip ahead a little bit to the Gola, because here it talks a great deal about the Gola. So if we go to page 114, at the bottom of the page is an explanation of the term Gola. And Gola is a Sanskrit word. Here it means round, or it could be like a sphere or something like that. So sometimes it is articulated as being more flat like a disc, and other times round means round like a sphere. So it could be one of those two. And it's orbiting by a circle of the lunar mansions over the 12 sectors. The 12 sectors being a division into the different parts of the sky. And this is known as the gola of the houses being the names associated with each of those. And now, in some cases of astrology and astronomy, ancient astronomy, those are equal divisions, so you just split it down the middle in both directions, and each of those gets split in the middle. But in some versions, they're not equal, because the forms of the stars that represent those actually push those boundaries, and so they move the lines a little bit to accommodate the stars that are supposed to be representing that particular house, if you will. It did not say anywhere that I noticed in here anyway which of those was the case, but in most cases it's talking about equal divisions of things, and so that would be my assumption, barring some other explanation. The way to understand this gola is from the circular charts drawn on paper and described in the Tantra and its commentary, which would be wonderful if those were included in the book, but of course they are not. So we don't have those charts that it says the way to understand this. And I actually looked on the internet to see what I could find, and was unable to find anything that was really close to what is being described in here either, although there may be things, but eventually I gave up, and so I didn't locate any of them. There may be some. There are some books on Tibetan astrology that might have some in them. I don't happen to have any of those books, so I didn't have anything that I could refer to, so apologized for that. So we just have to go based on what is presented here in the text. So at the bottom it also notes that the charts themselves are sometimes known as gola. So the term tends to be used in a variety of ways. Then at the top of page 115, it talks about how you draw the chart if you were to do that by hand, but it really doesn't give enough detail to allow us to accurately do that, I don't think. And then in the next paragraph, within the circle, the east, south, west, and north are each divided into two parts. And then together with the 4 intermediate directions, this makes the 12 parts in all. So it gives us an overview of that. And then it describes each of these. So in the east we have Aries, and then Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, and Virgo. Those are the 6 in the northern houses. And in the southern we have Libra, and Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, and Pisces. It looks like I missed Aquarius here. And those are the 6 southern houses. So one of the things that it talks about here are the shapes of those then. And so it talks about the bow-shaped and the fine lotus petals. But it's not real clear in the word descriptions that it gives exactly what that refers to. But at the top of page 116, the 6 houses of the south and the 6 houses of the north are bisected by a line representing the equinox path. And then we have the equinox is the point at which the days and the nights are equal on the path of the sun, moving from appearance point of view, north and south. And then the 6 houses of the south are in the shape of a bamboo bow. Now, it doesn't explain exactly what that shape is, but something that we apparently might be familiar with if we lived in that area. The 6 houses of the north then are in the shape of petals of half a lotus. So even though we don't have any visuals of what those things are, you can imagine a bow, or ordinary bow, not a recurve, but an ordinary bow just has a curve, a straight line where the string is, and a curve on the other side. And a lotus leaf would be pretty much like a curve, equal curves on both sides in this direction. Now, how those match up in terms of how it's articulated, related to a drawing, a chart that you would make for this, I don't know. And I may be wrong in interpreting what those shapes actually are as well. The second part of this then goes on to talk about, by understanding the above, how is it possible to understand the orbiting of the gola over each of those 12 sectors. But I think we'll come back to that. Well, now that we've got basic understanding of what the gola is, then we'll come back to that one. So we're going to go back then to page 110. And so here we have, again, we were talking about the assertions of others, which is where he starts, and then the assertion, his own assertion about this. And so the first part is the assertion of others. So south from the center of the gola, which would be the equinox, at the time of equal day and night, half of the circle of stars dwell in the south, and then north from the center of the gola chart, there dwell 6 houses. So it's divided between those that are on the north side and those that are on the south side here. And this describes the 12 houses. Now, I'm assuming from this, not being an expert in either astronomy or astrology, that what it's referring to is where the sun is relative to the equinox. So when it says above the equinox, it's talking about the sun being above the equinox, and when it's talking about below the equinox, it's talking about when the sun, when it is below that line. The south is below that line. So then it goes on page 111 to describe the 12 houses. So it gives us a little bit of information about them in the context of where they line up with each other and so forth. And then it talks a little bit more about the shapes, the bows and the lotus petals. And then it says at the bottom of the page, this explanation is incorrect, after having given us all of that. And then down at the very bottom, the last line, it says, the phrase in the north, the Shita Mountains, makes no sense. The formation of the 6 houses of the south are also not in the shape of a bow. So it's arguing against all of these things. And then in this next paragraph on page 112 here, the last few lines, it says, I cannot see this as being valid. The great commentary that the 6 houses of the north are arranged as lotus petals and the 6 of the south are in the formation of a bow refers to an event happening at one particular time, which it then goes into an explanation to try and describe what it means by this having happened at one time, so that it's no longer applicable, if you will. In the middle of that next paragraph, it does say, what the commentary is saying is that the circular gola chart of the 12 houses is to be bisected. The 6 houses placed in the northern, and 6 houses placed in the northern section, and then there are 6 placed in the south. So then it goes on to talk about the shapes and the locations in more detail. And so then we move on to the presentation of our own position. Okay, so what he was describing there was all what he's arguing is not the way that it actually is. So his position here is an explanation of the orbiting houses, how the houses orbit above the 12 sectors, and an explanation of how the length of day and night are formed by the sun's occupation of those houses. So we start with an explanation of the orbiting houses themselves. So he begins by saying each lunar mansion, is divided into 4. Each quarter is known as a step. So again, we're getting new terminology here. 9 such steps make up one house or lagna. So we have 12 houses in the zodiac. About every 2 hours you potentially pass into that as the earth rotates around, but from their point of view as the sky rotates around the earth, if you will. Or more specifically around Mount Meru as the central axis point. And so then it goes through and it talks about the makeup of these lunar mansions or houses and gives detailed explanations, each of which has slightly different names than the astrological ones that we are familiar with, although it links them up with those astrological names in the context of this. And then on the next page, 114, it talks about how the houses orbit above the 12 sectors. So this is the introduction and the section that we just looked at on an explanation of the term gola and the houses and the charts and so forth that were mentioned. And so we've gone through that, so we'll go back to where we stopped on page 116. The first main heading there, down about a third of the way. By understanding the above about the gola, how is it possible to understand the orbiting of the gola over each of the 12 sectors? So the gola is the rotation of the sky, basically, around the earth. So here in the great commentary, the last couple lines, it talks about the southern fire mandala to the borders of the great snows of the north, a distance of 75,000 yojana. So what we're basically talking about here is this range of movement of the sun from the south, which is represented by this southern fire mandala, up to the snows of the north. So the northern not equinox, the solstice is actually a little bit below Delhi in India, so we're getting up toward the land of the snows. We're not quite there yet, but that's what it's talking about, is from that point. But it's kind of a general area of up there to down at the very bottom. It's down kind of a desert region. Okay. But it also begins using this term in trying to describe the sizes of some of these things, the yojanas, which we talked about before. And in our text, it defined that as approximately 9 miles. The term comes from the idea of how far 2 oxen together can travel in a day. But that can vary quite a bit. There are sources that say that ranges anywhere from 4 miles to 10 miles. The most common one, apparently, from the sources that I looked at, said that the most common is 8 miles. But in our text, it talks about 9 miles. So I used that for my calculations here. So 75,000 yojana here would be 675,000 miles. Okay. The diameter of the Earth, to give you something to compare to, is 7,917. Okay, so we're talking about something way bigger than that. Comparing with the moon is 238,900 miles from the Earth. So that would be roughly 3 times that distance. It's past the moon, 2 more times is what it's talking about here. So some of the numbers that they give here are just a little bit off, let's say, from what we're talking about. So anyways, it's talking about the meridians being bisected midway, and then the northern parts of these intersections stretch for a distance of half of the 75,000 johana, or 37,500. So it's talking about this as the distance between the 2 points of the north and the south, and those are on the surface of the Earth. And so those distances are actually much, much shorter than what it's talking about here. And then similarly with the south intersection. And then in the last paragraph, the pathway of the 12 houses is over the other 11 sectors. So what is the pathway over the other 11 sectors? So then it begins trying to make give a description of that. And then on page 117, in the second paragraph, to illustrate the pathway of all 12 houses above each of the 11 sectors. And so then it begins to go through and give us the relative locations to each of the 12 houses here. So you have 12 sectors, you have the 12 houses, the eastern southern sector, the western southern sector, the central eastern sector, the eastern sector of the east, the western sector of the north, the central sector of the north, the eastern sector of the north, the westernmost sector of the west, the central sector of the north, the easternmost sector of the west, and the western sector of the south. So it goes through and then for each of those gives some detail about where they are located, how they relate to the others in terms of position and so forth, as well as the houses, how the houses in the sky appear above these different sectors. Therefore, at the very bottom of page 119, therefore this particular way of constructing charts on paper and other materials is a method of knowing clearly and unmistakably the path of the 12 houses over each of the 12 sectors. Unfortunately, he didn't draw those for us, or at least they are not provided in this text. In the next paragraph, on 120 here, the explanation is fire based upon the path of the lunar mansions and houses together with the other stars. And so then he actually talks a little bit about the angle of the sun, and he's making some comparisons with the projecting piece on a sundial, which he calls the, I'm not sure how you pronounce this, Goman maybe? I'm not sure if the N is pronounced or not, or maybe the G's not pronounced and it's a Noman. Yeah, oh, Noman, okay. So when that angle and the shadow created by that as the sun moves, and making a comparison of that, comparing that with when the sun is halfway, so at the equinox, and so forth, as a part of that. And then at the very bottom of the page says, this illustration of the pathway of the houses, lunar mansions, and sun is a generalization and rough depiction. So it's not real precise. The specific paths should be known from the explanations in the Gnosis chapter, which we will get to in part 2. The text of these explanations is missing from some translations, however. So I don't know if it's going to be in ours or not. Well, I guess we'll find out when we get to it. However, it is in some of the translations, and then it cites here at the top of 121 a little bit about that. The limits of the sun's travels north and south stretch 3/4 of the salt ocean up to Kailash for a distance of 50,000 yona, or 450,000 miles. Obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but you know, this is a conceptualization of it, not necessarily the actual planet Earth here. In a halved chart, day and night are about, it says space fire hours, which is about 30 hours. So again, compared to the 24-hour rotation of the Earth, it's a little bit different. And then 50,000 is completed in the eyes of Naga and Moon. This is basically a half year. And so it adds up to, it says 182 days, which is pretty close to a half year in our regular calendar. And then it says, this verse is the reference for a previous commentary quote, and so those previously mentioned scholars who have taught this are correct. So if you agree with me, you are correct. That seems to be the logic here. So we'll take a little bit of a break here at that point.